Go ahead, Simon.
Let's wait for the clock to tick round. Right, it's 8:30. Let's kick off. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name's Simon Collins. I'm Chair of Resilience First, and welcome to this breakfast briefing. Is your business truly resilient? Very topical stuff. First of all, let me add a thanks to Paul Ree for partnering once again with Resilience First in the delivery of something else we're launching today, which is the second edition of our NEDs guide, Non-Exec Directors Guide to Operational Resilience. We're really hoping that guide is going to become every non-exec director's companion and resource as they search for the best possible resilience practice. Very quick introduction for Resilience First. We were created in 2018 out of London First with the sponsorship and backing and membership of major corporates. We're a not-for-profit membership organisation, simple vision to develop global resilience network that's led by business, but to advance resilience and sustainable best practice delivered locally for mutual benefit between businesses and the society in which they operate. So a convening and best practice searching organisation. Earlier this year, we became part of an international consortium called Resilience Rising, which is a global non-profit resilience organisation funded by the Lloyd's Register Foundation. And they have a wonderful overarching ambition to accelerate a safe, resilient and sustainable future for all. So anyone got any questions about our work, please do get in touch with the team. So the purpose of the meeting, virtual breakfast discussion this morning with the authors of the second edition of our NEDs Guide to Operational Resilience, and we'll get a link out to everybody to the NEDs Guide straight after the event. I don't think anyone needs me to talk about the world being complicated, uncertain and horrible at the moment, sort of volatile, complicated, challenging world. And so for me, I think on the boards that I chair or observe, the experience and the objectivity that NEDs bring is really important. And at Resilience First, we think, frankly, that NEDs can be better prepared and more proactive in volatile and uncertain times. And that's exactly the purpose of our guide. It's to channel, first of all, channel the insights that NEDs have from their experience and to share that and give some best practice. And also, secondly, to give back some guidance so that NEDs can give appropriate and timely challenge, but also counsel to the exec teams and the businesses they work with in search of resilience. So we've got a series of chapters in the second edition. They focus on diversity and inclusion, terrorism resilience, cyber resilience, ESG and business property needs. And what's fantastic about the seminar this morning is we have the authors of those chapters to share their own invaluable insights, as well as to answer questions from our audience. So we've got Fiona Haythorne, co-founder and CEO of Women on Boards UK. We have Ed Butler, who's Chief Resilience Officer at Paul Ree. Luke Vile, Associate Director from PA Consulting. Emma Arnold, Director of ESG and Climate Resilience at Control Risks, and Emma Shipp as Consultant at Russell Cook. You've got all the speaker bios in the pack, so I'm not going to spend a long time introducing them, but you can see the wonderful experience and insights that they're able to bring. So quick guide to the running order. We're going to kick off with brief remarks from each speaker to tee up, frankly, the main benefit of the session, which is an interactive discussion with the audience. So we'll manage that in the usual way, by which I mean, please put your virtual hand up and we'll try and get you in the order that hands go up, and promise to get you away from the call at 9:30. So let me kick off by first of all inviting Fiona to say a few words, maybe around the theme. Fiona, D&I agenda, how do we use that to drive resilience in an organisation?
Well, thank you, Simon. I think the guide is superb because it gives you tips. So if you look at page 16 of the guide, it gives you tips, the 5 steps and the things that the board should be thinking about. So I thought I might just pick up 3 points from each of those. And then I think it's page 22 talks about the sorts of questions that the executives should be answering to the board. Because if you want inclusion, you need a good culture, and that has to be conscious, and it's difficult. And why do we want it? Because we want innovation. We want creativity, and we want performance. So it is important, and it is the board's job to make sure they put the right people in place and have the right culture to ensure the long-term survivability. And Simon, when we met last week, you talked about being at the helicopter level. You know, the boards are not doing, they're overseeing. So just 3 points out of what the things that the board might consider. Firstly, to ensure that the board takes sufficient time to change its culture. It is difficult when changing anything, and changing culture is difficult. So accept that it's not going to happen overnight. The other thing to do is to make sure you have a strong voices coming towards you from your customers and your employees, and the board should be seeing and hearing that in some way and not just listening to the executives. And the other final thing that the board can do, and then I'll talk about what the executive to do, there's more points in the report, is to make sure the board has indicators given to them on what's happening with regard to pay gaps, what's happening with regard to turnover, and what's happening at every level, not just an overall number, but at the division and the department level, so that they can see where the change is happening. Now that's just the board. Own it and make sure that the executive team are reporting to you on it. With regard to the executives on page 22, you'll see more detail. The first thing is to make sure as an executive that whatever you're doing in terms of initiatives with regard to inclusion, and I think most of the money should be spent on the leadership team and are they able to lead consciously, is make sure what's happening is improving your strategic performance rather than hindering it. We work with about 40 different organisations, and I've seen the good, the bad and the seriously ugly. And a lot of companies have lost control of their employee representative groups, and those employee representative groups are a fantastic voice as to what's going on, so be careful. Gender and ethnicity pay gaps. Don't just report at the government level. Make sure, because they're just simple mean, medians and averages at the top level. Go into the department level and the divisional level and really make sure that you want that data, because it should enable you to identify what's going wrong and where. And then look at where the tipping points are, at what stage, if you're recruiting the best people on a 50-50 basis, and I'm just looking at gender here, but you would look at all the other characteristics as well, where is it then dropping off? Because it will tell you something about your culture. If you're recruiting at the 50-50 level, but in 3 to 4 years' time, one of a particular characteristics, whether it's LGBT, if you have that data, ethnicity or gender, is leaving, you have to ask yourself, what is it that the culture of the company is doing themselves to lose the fantastic talent that presumably they recruited in the first place? So I think that's just a quick statement from me to allow the panel to move on and get to discussions, but do read it, because these are the questions the board should be asking. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Fiona. And we'll move, if we may, to Ed. Morning, Ed. Terrorism resilience, or terrorism, pops up too frequently, and what can NEDs do about it in terms of raising the issue and building resilience?
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and good morning to everyone. Delighted to be part of this panel discussion and contribute to the guide, which you'll all read later. I won't go through the guide, but I do recommend that you read it, whether you're a NED, an aspiring NED, or a member of the executive senior management team. There's a lot of, as Fiona's saying, top tips in there. I've got sort of 3 points really to make, and then hopefully lots of questions will come. Is that the first, that despite war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, cost of living crisis, coming out of COVID, the threat of terrorism has not gone away. And we need to make sure, boards in particular, that the management teams are not distracted by the here and now, and that they remain focused on some of those further away threats, and some of them are obviously from homegrown threats. So I think that'd be my first point. Clearly the threat from Russia is existential, but actually the threat from terrorism, global terrorism and homegrown terrorism hasn't gone away. It's persistent, it's out there, and I think we'd all recognise that our humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan last August did provide a major boost for all jihadists globally, especially when they saw they defeated one of the world's superpowers. And I think on that there'll be a concern that they will exploit the West's distraction with Ukraine and all the focus and resources going into that. So we need to be conscious of that. Plus, rather a grey day in London for those who are here, but the summer's here, crowded places are returning. The streets of London are certainly packed in the evenings, which provide opportunity target sets. It's not just about Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, obviously, alive and well in Syria and Iraq, but we must obviously also look at the continuing rise of the far right. We all know what happens in America comes over to the UK, and we saw the awful attacks in Norway against the Pride demonstration. But also those emerging threats, and I know the Home Office and others concerned about us, the eco-terrorism, eco-warrior threats, which could turn into more violent disorder. Also, I think from a threat perspective, certainly now when times get tough, for whatever reason that is, of the insider threat, the disgruntled employer who may be susceptible to terrorism influence or activity. And then lastly, and I know it's covered in the guide, that whole risk of cyber, terrorist use of the cyber domain. And I'm pretty threat actor agnostic when it comes to cyber security, but we just need to remember that. I think my second point is more from a macro perspective, is that, those macro drivers of insecurity are going to fuel discontent, division, extremism, terrorism and violence, be it from the far right, far left or eco-terrorism. And by that, I'm looking at the impact of the climate security nexus, global food poverty, the famine, population growth, migration, immigration, which is all going to come. These are the bow waves which are coming towards, which will fuel further extremism and populism. And that divide between the haves and the have-nots is only going to get greater over the coming months and year or so. So we know what those known consequences are from a board perspective. We need to be at our role. The NED role is looking at what are the unintended consequences, which the busy executive and management teams are focusing on the here and now, and rightly so. What are they not looking at? My third point is, and most of you will be well aware of the forthcoming Protect duty. We won't go through what the background of that is, but I think we are going to see some form of announcement in the not too distant future, whether it's, well, let's see what happens on a government level and the Home Office, but I think in the next few months we will see that legislation which will come out. And it will mean that up to 650,000 businesses may have to take some form of risk assessment, a terrorism risk assessment. And this is going to be the biggest single change in the terrorism risk landscape in the UK. And that will mean that those businesses, and they're looking at various thresholds, will need to undertake some form of terrorism risk assessment formally for the first time. And I think the board should be challenging the management team and saying, what needs to be done? Who's going to do it? Are these people accredited? But I think the greatest significance is the focus on the Protect duty will be about the liability that these incidents are going to cause, and the negligence which will contribute to any injury caused or claimed for, and that will be, then susceptible to whatever employers and public liability policies. And that, I think, is going to be a key matter for boards to really focus on to make sure that all that is in order. Plenty of issues with Protect duty. What are the thresholds? Is one's business going to fall in the threshold, the higher, medium or lower threshold? What type of risk assessment is going to be there? Is your business an owner, an operator or a manager? I think the distinction between what's a publicly accessible location, what's a venue, what's a site, what's going to fall in, what's going to fall out. Plenty of questions for the board to consider. So I think my last sort of conclusion, lots for the Risk and Audit Committee, because I think this is where it's really going to fall, but obviously the board is going to be responsible across for the remainder of this. Is the correct governance in place for Protect duty? Does one risk register reflect all the terrorism threats which are out there, and have they thought them? And have you got the assurance from the executive management team that the business and your employees are resilient to terrorism incidents? And really, lastly, as ever, consider those reputational risks and whether this is within the Protect duty or outside it. But if there was a terrorism incident which impacted directly or indirectly on your business, have you got the right protective security measures in place? If not, you are going to be liable. That's all from me. I'm very happy to take questions after 9 o'clock.
Terrific. Thank you, Ed. And if we can move rapidly on to Luke. Luke, you're talking about technology, and we all see on the boards we're on the incredible pace of technology moving. How do NEDs stay up to speed with digital resilience?
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me. I think what we've seen over the past 3 or 5 years is quite a significant increase in NEDs coming to us and wanting to be more involved. Perhaps feeling that cybersecurity, information security hasn't been historically something which a NED might have to be an expert in, but now maybe feeling like they should be. Probably driven by a couple of the points which I think are in the guide, so I won't go into in lots of detail, but basically that cybersecurity is now a top 5 or top 3 risk for a lot of organizations. It's an area of quite serious investment for a lot of organizations, and it's also an area of significant interest by customers or clients or regulators or insurers, sorry. And all of that is driving that interest for NEDs to reach out and ask to be trained in some cases, admitting actually feeling a little bit exposed by not having spent a lot of time in this area historically, and certainly not able to draw on a career of experience in cybersecurity as perhaps they can in other areas. The other aspect is maybe not having quite as well trodden paths for information and reports and feedback as maybe with other risks that they might advise on. So what I think is in the guide is divided some of this advice into 2 areas, which I often find NEDs come and ask about. The first is looking at their own governance capabilities in cybersecurity, which I'll perhaps pick on one in a moment, but also how they can protect themselves in how they work. I guess the role and the functioning of a NED is a bit unusual for a lot of organizations. So those 2 things combined actually form quite a lot of the questions that certainly people come and ask me about. One of the things that I always advise NEDs to look at in the first case is their own personal footprint. And it's an area that actually very few people in general look at on a regular basis and sort of carefully manage, but in particular, the unique nature of how NEDs operate and work with organizations does, I think, increase their exposure. So often what we'll advise people in a NED role to do is to look at their portfolios online. Some of them will have websites or biographies on LinkedIn or indeed on the organizations which they work with. Often these are quite well rounded. They'll talk about the basics, roughly where they live in an area. They'll talk about their family, perhaps giving some names away, talking about hobbies, etc. But also in some cases we see phone numbers and email addresses published on NED's own websites. Obviously as a means to contact them, to speak at events, to be approached for appointments. And often people are quite surprised that all of those pieces of information, or some of them, can be stitched together to launch an attack. I think most NEDs I talk to are aware nowadays that they might be targeted, especially and in unique ways, but often quite surprised that with their mobile numbers that can be used to launch a spoof SMS attack, or some of the family information can be used to socially engineer meetings or conversations and information coming back. One of the other areas that the Metropolitan Police did quite a successful campaign on a couple of years ago, but we often don't see it talked about anymore, is the information that non-exec directors will publish indirectly through Companies House. A lot of NEDs, particularly those starting out, maybe with 1 or 2 appointments, will have their home addresses listed as their official correspondence on Companies House, again adding another pathway in which they can be socially engineered. And so often what we'll do is work with a NED every 12 months or whenever they approach, and just look at the information out there and see what can be cut back. So that's one one way in which I think NEDs can protect themselves. The other point I was going to mention is around NEDs governance capabilities, and I suppose for the audience here, this is as much about what we can be doing for NEDs as they can be reaching out and asking for. But one of the most effective ways I found of engaging a NED in a cybersecurity or operational resilience program is to have them be actively part of a security incident simulation. I think often NEDs haven't been involved in observing simulations, being part of the process after a simulation, and are quite surprised at just how powerful those can be for discovering vulnerabilities in security management, particularly around assumptions and dependencies that are flushed out on those kind of simulations, and just how effective they can be at supporting the identification of new risks as a result, and the impact of known risks as well. And I think what works quite well with NEDs is helping to shift the mindset from looking at the cause of the problem in a simulation to actually the lessons learned. And this is something we see sector-wide. And for anybody in financial services working around the new operational resilience policy will know that the lessons learned process is a key part of it. And so getting NEDs involved in a simulation not only helps them be part of that lessons learned process and really challenge the organization as to what can be changed as a result, but what it also does is build a level of empathy with the feeling of an incident. And I think that's one thing which is probably most stark for me when I talk to a NED who's been through that process or indeed lived through a real incident, is just how quickly things can change, how surprising it is to work in an information vacuum where a lot of things that you might think would be known are just not certain yet. And bringing them into that process, particularly if they can challenge future simulations, has been really fantastic, I think, in building engagement. Happy to go into that in a bit more detail through questions, but otherwise I'll hand back.
Thank you, Luke. You've already got me terrified about personal digital footprint and homework after the session. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. And let's turn now to Emma Arnold. Morning, Emma. I mean, I hear NEDs worry about ESG being the elephant in the room, sort of huge topic, but many different definitions and so on. But how can getting some clarity into an effective ESG plan help with the operational resilience?
Sure, thank you, Simon. Well, I can hear myself. Well, thank you. I think the short answer to that is just being proactive around ESG. Is going to reduce your risk, and that in turn, creates resilience and also opens up opportunities for your business. So I know you hear this 1,000 times, but it just makes good business sense. Mismanagement, on the other hand, creates, opens you up to the risk of legal action, business inefficiency, not attracting talent, as Fiona's just mentioned, stranded assets, which we're seeing, more and more topical these days, reputational risks. I could go on. And in May, we saw the first ESG dawn raid of Deutsche Bank. So I think we can really expect more legal action around greenwashing as we go forward. So it's really something that boards need to pay attention to, and also be aware of what's being communicated within their organisation. I've been auditing ESG matters now for some 25 years, and it still astounds me that in some cases businesses just aren't getting the basics right. We're still allowing tanks to leak due to poor maintenance. We're still failing on basic health and safety. We're still wasting millions off our bottom lines via inefficient energy, waste and water management. And these are just really the basics, and I've not even gone down the road of net zero and the kind of more modern topics that are coming down the road. So I thought today it would just be helpful if I try and distill my experience, and this is all echoes the guide, and talk about kind of many sort of 3 topics. So being aware of your corporate ESG landscape and the regulation that sits behind it. Being, managing your data, and ensuring your governance structures are reaching all parts of your organisation, and as just said, just do the basics right. So before you do anything else, you do need to understand what your ESG landscape is. As Simon's just mentioned, it covers a vast myriad of topics under the 3 pillars. And what's material to your business will depend really on your sector and also the geographies in which you operate. SASB provides some really useful sectoral guides on materiality. So if you need any help and kind of confused by the topics, then kind of check those out first, because they really are very helpful. But remember that ESG should never be a one-size-fits-all solution. It very much should support your own corporate values and the purpose of your organisation. So it is really it's a personal thing. And so as NEDs, I think you can really help and guide in respect to this. Also, just be careful of pledges and signatories. I'm a real supporter of these, but if you're just signing up to them without fully embedding them in your organisation, then you're going to be at risk of greenwashing. And also ensure you're transparent. The best corporate reports are really clear that ESG is a journey. There will be challenges and problems along the way. You might not get everything right all the time, but just be transparent about that. You know, tell people about those challenges. And I think the market will respect you for it. Whatever your non-financial reporting KPIs that you set for your organisation, be sure about you set clear boundaries for these. For example, do they exclude particular entities of your business or regions? If they do, just be prepared to communicate this and give the reasons why you've excluded them. So transparency really is key. And I think a lot of kind of boards are scared of that. But it's really key. And you'll see the best organisations, they're fully transparent on where their problems are. So, for example, I'm currently working with a global corporation that's signed pretty much every pledge going. You name it, they've got it on their website, and they've also set some really weighty KPIs around ESG matters, net zero, water reduction, etc., etc. So we're currently working with their operations in Nigeria to help their management team firstly understand what these KPIs are and why they apply to them and what they mean for their business and why they're important. So as I said before, just make sure it's reaching out into every part of your business, wherever it is in the world. Because it's really easy to set a KPI. It's the operationalizing part of it that's hard, particularly if you haven't allocated appropriate budgets to deal with it. So this brings me kind of onto regulation. We've really seen an exponential increase in environmental law over the last few years, with more than 170 environmental treaties and instruments established in the EU alone since the turn of the century. So ask yourself the question, how can you be sure that your business is compliant? When did you last update your legal register? One thing's for certain, we can only expect environmental legislation. I'm not even touching on the social and governance here, but we can only expect regulation to increase. And we've already in the last 18 months seen a lot of governments mandate TCFD, for example. So my guidance to you as NEDs is not just understand not just what the current legislation around your market is, but also keep an eye on what's coming down the road. And thirdly, data. I know this has been mentioned by quite a few of the panel so far today, but I'm guessing no one here that's listening this morning wants to be a focus of a dawn raid. So as boards and leadership, there's a real risk that as more and more pledges are made to kind of keep up with the Joneses, as it were, that you're not operationalizing these risks, and there might be an unwatched part of your organisation that's going awry. And that could lead you at risk of a legal claim or reputational risk or however it transposes. So have a robust plan for your ESG data, know how it's going to be collated, know how it's going to be funded, importantly, and who's responsible for that data management and also its assurance. During a recent materiality assessment for a relatively low risk services company, so we're not talking high risk ESG stuff here, their strategy required them to collect 256 individual bits of data in order to respond to their non-financial reporting that they wanted to do for their KPIs. Putting in this management structure took significant investment and also took about 2 years. to do. So just be mindful that depending on the size of your organisation, of course, this could take some time. So this brings me nicely on to governance. During my time auditing many companies around the world, the root cause of most issues is generally down to a lack of governance in some way, shape or form. So as a NED, I think you can support your board by ensuring that there's appropriate governance in place. How this is structured really will depend on your organisation. So it may be one person, it may be a team of 100 global people, but just be really sure about who's responsible, who's accountable, and who should be consulted or just informed. And just be clear that this should be disseminated throughout every part of your business. So this is where you really need to deploy systems thinking. So make sure procurement's on board, for example, for ESG when you're wanting this to be sent down into your supply chains. And I think we've already touched on culturally. So I think ESG does need to be a cultural shift, just as we saw the shift in health and safety in the 80s. So I'll echo, it's huge, many topics under each pillar. So my guidance would be, as I sum up, don't try and boil the ocean, work out what's material for your business, prioritise these, delegate responsibilities, set baselines, and make sure your data is supporting you on this journey. And also, please think long term. ESG is a long-term issue, and make sure that those responsible are incentivised for these goals beyond their term of office. So their term of office may be measured in a matter of years. ESG improvements, some of them can take decades. So you need to make sure that each board is building off its predecessor, or you could just risk going around in circles.
Emma, thank you. A huge topic in itself, and one of 5 huge topics this morning. Thank you very much. We turn to the t'other Emma Shipp. Morning, Emma. And another big issue that's vexing many boards that I see at the moment is the return to work and workspace and office space and so on. What's the latest position on office space that NEDs need to consider when thinking about resilience?
Great. Well, thank you, Simon, and good morning, everyone. And I'd really echo what Fiona and others have said, that the guide, I very much recommend you read the guide, because it's very practical. A lot of stuff I'm sure we all read nowadays is quite theoretical, but this has got really good tips for NEDs. So in terms of office space, really there's 2 key points. I'm conscious of time, so I'm only going to speak quite briefly. 2 key points for NEDs to really take on board at a high level, and this needs to sort of filter down into more operational resilience. But the first is to keep your space requirements under more constant review than you have done before. So previously, you would have been able to deal with your office space, deal with property very irregularly, maybe once a year you could look at it, whatever, and you could also delegate it to professionals within the organisation. But I do think that NEDs really need to become more involved, and they need to review the office space and space utilisation with the changing working patterns. It's no longer the case that you can think, right, I've ticked the box, I don't need to think about our property requirements now for another year. So that's the first thing, is to keep it under review. And secondly, what goes alongside that is that you do need to build in flexibility. You've got to balance this up with certainty. It can't be wholly flexible so that you don't know from one week to the next what property you're going to have. But on the other hand, I think what the pandemic taught us is that those who had long leases, very fixed, very inflexible, really did struggle when things changed pretty much overnight. So we need to be prepared that working patterns are different now, and they are much more fluid. And so you need to think about flexibility, whether that's baked into the terms of your lease, in terms of the ability to break it, or a turnover rent, or whether it's more informal, and this is where NEDs can also add value. So if they foster a good relationship with the landlord, that can be absolutely key, and is often more important. I say this as a lawyer, it's more important than the legal documents, that you have a good relationship with your landlord, and that senior level with NEDs being involved can often tip the balance in a business's favour. So those are the two key points. And finally, I would just mention staff. Obviously, we picked up staff on a number of different points, but really, certainly where I'm a non-exec director, those hard to fill posts have moved right up to the top of the risk register because, you know, this is something that everybody's struggling with. And although salary is important and, you know, increasingly so in today's world, the other thing that staff look at is their working environment. What are you offering them? And I use that term widely. It's not just the bricks and mortar, it's your whole attitude to health and safety. It's how you treat people, the culture that you foster. That's really going to retain people and attract them to your business. So this is something that NEDs can't simply delegate, can't think that's, you know, that's not something that should be on the agenda. This is something that they've got to get stuck into really quite seriously. So that's all I'll say for now, and I'll pass back to Simon, and happy to take questions.
Emma, fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to kick off in a minute because I've got about 100 questions, but can just to plead to everybody really, can we keep questions and answers brief, because I think there's quite a lot to get through in the chat. So I wanted to kick off, if I may, by going back to something Fiona was talking about in the importance of diversity. And one of the things that was going through my mind was I was actually thinking about the government and thinking about diversity of thought, because, you know, you could look, I don't want to demonize the government any more than happening already at the moment, but you could look at the government and say, actually, there's quite decent diversity on some metrics like gender and ethnicity and so on, but actually very little diversity of thought could be an argument, and sometimes you see that in boards as well. How important is that, and what can NEDs do to challenge it?
Simon, if I could come in on that one, I think what's really, really important is they widen their net when they're searching for non-executive directors. You know, best practice at the FTSE 350 level is to use a headhunter. I can assure you quite a few in the 250 still don't. And outside the FTSE 350, lots of them still don't. Many of them are now using our vacancy board to transparently advertise to people they don't know. Shocker. And that really widens the pool, and we can work with headhunters, and it's really important. The word transparency has come up. Emma talked about it as well as how important it is. Don't hide from these issues, own these issues, and widen the net. And then you will find people with different economic backgrounds, different areas of the country. They all see and they hear and they feel different things, and that's what you need in the boardroom.
Great, thank you. I encourage people to, I can't see any hands up, so it might be a fault with my my screen, but please do come forward if you've got a comment or a question for the panel. If not, I will continue to hog it temporarily. So I wanted to go back, Luke, to something you said about boards and their composition and technical awareness. Do you think boards should have actual techie NEDs, or do you think actually it's the very sort of common sense basic challenge that actually they need from uninformed NEDs?
That's a great question, because I was going to come in off the back of what Fiona was saying to add that point, and I thought I'd wait. I guess it's fair to say that perhaps historically the view was that on a board you have a cyber sponsor or a technology sponsor, somebody who was really clued up and knew what questions to ask and knew when they were being given tough information, and could kind of act as the, you know, the focus point for the board. I think the big challenge there is obviously you only have one person's opinion and experience out of, you know, however many, and of course the big risk that we see in a lot of security leadership roles at the moment, which we know certainly in financial services regulators are interested in, is that when those people go, you have a gap, sometimes 3, 6, maybe even 12 months, when there aren't those skills there. So certainly my advice would be to ensure that the board as a collective have a certain level of cybersecurity experience and knowledge. I don't think it's ever going to be realistic to have a board or a team of non-exec directors who can carry out their own penetration testing and network configuration. But I think what you do need is a capability to be able to challenge, to ask those commensurate questions around cybersecurity. But I think increasingly boards can get that through training to build up the collective base.
Great, thank you. That's certainly my experience. That actually the last thing you want is a deep technical expert who's a frustrated exec grabbing the steering wheel. But actually a little bit of knowledge to channel the questions and the challenges is really important. So thank you, Alistair.
Hi, good morning. I thought the insight was excellent from all of the speakers. I wondered whether, resilience is quite a relatively new science, and, for non-exec directors just joining boards just now, should they expect a lot of discussion about resilience? So our boards, is the culture of a board now very much more mindful of what resilience means to the organisation? And indeed the kind of wider society resilience as well, or is this still being discussed at lower than board level? So can NEDs expect the discussion about resilience at all boards? And I don't know about me, about everybody else, but Simon seems to have frozen, so I'm quite happy, Fiona, if you want to answer that.
Go on, Fiona.
I don't know if I'm just going to say, I think historically, there was a risk register, and all NEDs knew that we needed a risk register. And I think, one of the things that we've all talked about is owning it across the organisation. This takes time. And I think that's where resilience comes in, that, even somebody who's running reception in the door should be asked about what risks are around here. And that's the same with the environment. And I think there's been a big step change in what we need to do. I don't think for 1 minute that's what's happening in the boardroom at the moment.
Yeah, and if I just added quickly on that, I think boards, and now my experience sitting on the board of EDF is that people are starting to recognise that you've got to join up the physical and the cyber/virtual and your sort of cultural and emotional resilience, whether that's on mental health or just people's attitude to work. And I think that sort of stepping back is important. I think it's only just starting, to be honest, and echo Fiona's point about we've got the risk register, we've ticked the box on it, let's crack on.
Yeah,
I always at this point have to give a plug to Sir Ian Andrews, one of our senior members, who chides us every time we have a meeting talking about NEDs and says that the role of the NED is not to bring out the risk register every year, admire it and put it back in the drawer. So add that in. Mike, morning.
Good morning. We've dealt with quite a few chunky items, and the guide also from last year has a number of major areas. How would you as a NED prioritise these is what I was thinking on, and then how we might help them to prioritise.
Leap in, panel.
Well, for me, I think from a ESG point of view, but I think this kind of the general theory probably stems out across all the topics, is it really comes down to materiality. So, how material are these issues to your business? So, I mean, ESG is a vast, and it covers, diversity and inclusion, it covers health and safety, but, and some of them will be mandatory because they're driven by regulation. Some others won't be mandatory. They might not be, so it's really how material is that particular issue to your sector, to your geographies, and it's really going to depend. So I think it's like get your risk register and make sure, for me personally, I think ESG should be kind of weaved in throughout all the other risks, not just a bottom line kind of risk. But every board tackles it slightly differently.
I'd also add to that, if I can just jump in, that one of the roles of the NED is to seek outside insight from what other organisations are doing, what experience is out there that maybe isn't owned within the organisation. And I know to Ed's point earlier about insider risk, that's one area that I know a lot of organisations are working on, bringing many of these different points together as a result of other organisations having exposure to it.
And just very quickly, the is I think this is a key role for the chair. Having observed many boards and been on boards, each NED can have their own sort of parochial interest. They may come with their own company sort of hat on, and I think that's just really important that the chair is able to pull them back up and say, right, what's the aggregation of the risks, the cumulative risks which we're facing here, and what is actually the priority one which we're facing at the moment, but also what's coming round the corner which we're not actually looking at.
I just also echo that in terms of the chair. I'm feeling for Simon because you're a very experienced chair. Mike, your question, gave me stress just listening to it. But I think what's crucial is there has to be trust around that table, facilitated by the chair, and we then need to do the detailed work in the committees because there is so much to do. There's so much to think about. There's so much to engage with. So I think Ed bringing in the chair point was a great thing, because unless the chair is supporting those committees and everybody's working in a trust environment, culture in the boardroom matters as well.
And it so goes back to the altitude at which NEDs work, because there is easily 365 days a year most NEDs could get involved in salient issues for the business, and of course they can't. And we've got a sort of comment question online from Robert Hall. Morning, Robert. You've cheered us up by reminding us that catastrophic risks are on the rise, but asking, probably throw this at Ed in the first instance, is thought being given in boards generally to broadening out insurance coverage to include some of those things, terrorism, cyber, pandemics and so on?
I didn't see his question because I've been thick. I can't find the question, but I've got the gist of it. And thanks, Robert. Good to hear from you. I think, the catastrophic risk, certainly on those, how we manage strategic tail risk is really important. We've seen that from COVID. And I think people were caught unawares on that, of the sort of consequential risks which we're facing from an event which may not directly impact on your business. I think that's really important to consider. And actually, we can't just forget about COVID and saying we're now on a cost of living crisis and we've got this and this. So I think there is a lot which boards can do in terms of understanding it. What are those macro risks which are going to impact on my business, our business, and how would we manage the consequences of that? And is there a role that I can transfer some of that risk in through the insurance mechanism and actually sort of challenge the people who buy your insurance, saying, are we actually buying the right type of cover? Do we need to pay more? Or if actually we've gone through, is our risk appetite appropriate for those risks right there? And the trouble is, like all insurance, you say, help, I need to cover everything now, and then it becomes too expensive. But at least if you've gone through the process, so you can either transfer it, or actually how do we mitigate it through other practical measures, whether it's people trading, physical, or through cyber activity. So good questions, Robert.
And Ed, of course, there's a role for government in supporting that, because some of these things are just too big, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, and we have this debate with government on a fairly regular basis about, what remains on the government's balance sheet and what could actually be transferred to the insurance market. And from an insurance perspective, we feel there's actually more which could be taken on by the insurance market. Those big risks, the CBRN, the macro cyber attack and stuff, that actually is, as we saw with COVID, is going to sit on the government's balance sheet. But it's understanding what is affordable and acceptable risk which could be taken by the market, because that will be written if we understand the risk and we've got the data to model it.
Simon, can I just come back on that, if I may, and follow with a follow-up sort of point? Ed, thank you for that. The insurance industry seems to have had a particularly bad reputational hit as a result of the pandemic. And it seems that people's lack of confidence in taking out some of these large insurance risks have been severely damaged. What is the insurance industry doing, and perhaps through NEDs, to try and redeem some of that, so that there's a more confidential response from the public in taking it out? Because otherwise, I think it will drift. Thanks.
Yes, help. You're now putting me on the spot as a representative of the insurance industry, and although I'm in the reinsurance, that's not my 40 years of experience. It's a good question. The reputation of the insurance during COVID was badly impacted. I think the lesson, really, one of the lessons from it is to to really understand what is covered and what is not covered, and that's all down to the wording. And again, I think this should be a role for the NEDs to say, yeah, we've got insurance cover in place for X and Y, but actually, do they really understand what that cover, that policy is covering and what it is not covering? And that's really what the issue is, because the insurance by rule will exclude what they see as uninsurable or high cost risks. And there's clearly a price to pay for that if you want that type of cover. But I think it's really down to the lawyers to say, what have we actually got in there? What does the wording say? Because that's where it will always come down to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Robert. I wanted to come back to something that's really been resonating with me, which is to be careful of pledges, Emma, that you talked about. And at Resilience First, we had quite a scary update session on modern slavery the other week. And, you know, I'm certainly conscious from boards I see that it's the sort of thing where boards quite quickly adopt, you know, UN language or do something and sort of virtue signal around things like that. And actually, you know, when you poke around in supply chain and other things, there's a whole lot more work needed on it. I mean, there's just one example, but I think that be careful of pledges is a really important point.
Yeah,
sorry, I was conscious. I should have either stressed that was a comment or asked a question at the end of it.
Yeah. Well, I'd add on the in diversity and inclusion, many companies have won awards for their diversity and inclusion strategies, and you know, I can assure you quite a few of those people are not as good as they say they are, and it actually upsets their employees when they see those awards being won, because they know the reality of what's going on, and those awards have been used by the marketing and the PR team as branding. And I think, you know, it really resonated with me, that comment as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Troyer.
Good morning, everyone. This has been an awesome way to start the day and it's blown my mind in terms of the breadth of the discussion. I sit on a couple of charities, and one of the questions that we sort of mull over occasionally is all of this about being more and more insightful, or is this about our organisations being more and more nimble? And one's very much about information and knowledge and almost being clever, and the other's actually recognising that we can't be ever clever enough, and actually being competent in being nimble is perhaps where we should focus our time and effort. I'm just interested in the panel's opinion, actually. Should we focus on being clever or should we focus on being nimble?
Great question.
Glib answer, of course, is why choose, but let me throw that out to the panel.
I think the insightful is perhaps more around the NED's role, because if you think of a NED as having that oversight, they are the ones who can have a slightly wider view because of their other experience. So the insightful perhaps is slightly more in their bag. The nimble is a bit more around operational. How can we put this into practice? It's around the sort of flexibility that I was talking about, which is easy to, you know, in hindsight, it's easy to say, why did we not? But actually, you've got to be much more forward looking when it comes to flexibility and being nimble. So that's sort of more in the bag around the operational. But yes, it's hard to choose. I think one sort of leads into the other. Insights often lead into thinking, you know, we need to do things differently, and we need to be ready for the unexpected, which is obviously a very tall order for a board.
I think I'd also add to that, to give a politician's answer in the spirit of the day, that I tend to tell people it's about proportionality more than anything else. So I know it doesn't necessarily answer your question, but as a former trustee for a number of years in a small charity, and now working with charities in cybersecurity, often, certainly when you talk to non-exec directors, and going back to the point in my bit at the beginning about starting them on that journey of discovering cybersecurity and getting involved in it, sometimes they can go a bit too far and think, well, actually, you know, this is a pretty scary risk now that I'm being asked to look at. It seems like no amount of money can ever make us secure, and it's quite a frightening concept for them to get into. So often I'll try and keep people grounded on that sense of proportionality, and I think that's where organisations like the ICO and other bodies are really helpful in supporting that message that good security isn't spending X million a year on cybersecurity risk management. It is about taking proportionate responses to risks.
And Luke, let me stay with you for a second, because I think it goes back to Stephen's point about being clever. You made a point quite briefly about sort of fear of being exposed as a NED, and you were making it around the sort of tech space, but for you and all the panel really, I think one of the great necessary qualities of a NED is getting over fear of being exposed, because a lot of NEDs, new NEDs, have a sort of form of imposter syndrome around it. There's an asymmetry of information that the exec team have relative to NEDs, so you can feel quite intimidated and not want to ask the stupid questions, which goes back to groupthink and so on. I'm seeing enough sort of affirmative sort of signs, body language from the panel. I mean, we really do need to help NEDs get over that sort of fear of being exposed and actually ask some of the stupid questions, don't we?
Yeah, and I'll give a very short response, because I'm sure others will want to as well. But I've spoken to NEDs a couple of years ago. I was doing work with a lot of wealth management NEDs, and some of them said that we've been involved in the leadership of organisations since Thatcher, and the concept of risks that we manage is very, very traditional and very, very in a box that may not have really changed since the 80s. So this idea now that a top 3 risk, and in some organisations a number 1 risk, is now suddenly what everybody's asking me for, is quite scary, particularly when they feel like they come into a room, they're charging organizations X amount a day, and they can't really challenge in the same way, to that point that I mentioned, where somebody may have had a board with one tech cyber person on. So yeah, it is absolutely something to pick up. But I think more and more people want to. I can't remember the last time I was asked to give some training to a board and somebody didn't want to be trained. So it's a good sign.
Yeah. Fiona, then Emma.
Being on a board is not for everyone. Ex-chief executives often don't make good NEDs because they're used to commanding and controlling things, but you can't be across everything. And it's one of the reasons that my organisation says, well, you work on your culture, we'll go and come in and give your employees a present and help them realise their board potential by going on external boards. And that was alluded to, because if you choose the right board, it's a mini MBA on leadership and governance, and you don't always get an understanding of why governance comes into your organisations, but you do when you sit on the other side of the table. And I think it makes you better executives, which is why we do that with the companies we work with. Emma.
I was just going to say that I just don't assume that it's happening, and don't assume that it's all going right. So actually asking stupid questions enables you to find that out, because quite often it's not going right. So yeah, I think stupid questions are great.
It's brilliant to have my core skill of asking stupid questions validated by the panel, what I particularly like. So we're go on, Alistair, one quick question.
Yeah, just my cue for stupid question then. Has COVID changed anything? I mean, Fiona talked about the culture of boards. Has the pandemic changed the culture of boards in the last couple of years?
I don't know if anybody else that wants to come in. I mean, it changed a lot because we've got hybrid boards now. So I think some of the detailed work, committees were happening the day before these big board meetings. People had massive information overload and therefore weren't able to take them so seriously. You can have pre-meetings in a virtual environment, but the culture of what our executives are prepared to accept and do in terms of the way they work also matters. So yes, it's definitely changed, and boards need to get up with that, but actually executive teams more so.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think for me, we've seen boards become accepting of the concept that those big, to Ed's point, CBRN level events can and do happen. So that's been fantastic. I know there are some government bodies that see that as not being fantastic, because people think, yeah, we've done that, we've got through COVID, we can get through anything. Actually, I think COVID was in some ways very asymmetrical, because it did take quite a while to come in the scheme of resilient level events, and it affected everybody. So I think in some ways it's actually quite an asymmetrical event.
Thank you. So we're pretty much out of time. I'm going to attempt the impossible, a breathtaking act of arrogance, and try and summarise an extraordinarily rich conversation. And I'm not even going to try and do justice to it, but I'm just going to give some the points that leapt out to me. First of all, get the basics right. Always good advice. And for me, sometimes that's visualizing a stakeholder map. So for NEDs to actually sort of think physically around the stakeholders and actually think whether the business and the team are thinking about those stakeholders, both as stewards, but also thinking about what can disrupt and have threats to resilience. The look at personal footprint is going to stay with me, at least for the morning, while I go anxiously into to LinkedIn and so on and check. I think being careful of pledges is great advice around that stakeholder map. You know, CEOs are careful to avoid pledges, or sometimes careful around performance and so on. But actually, careful of pledges is a wonderful mantra for NEDs, I think. Asking questions at the right altitude. I think for me, you know, NEDs learning to operate, and I think what Fiona was saying about CEOs making lousy NEDs. My sense actually is they make great NEDs, but there's an awkward transition period where they have to learn not to grab the steering wheel every time they don't like something, and then they make great NEDs. Go for NEDs you don't know, and the radical nature of that. I mean, that must be so right in terms of getting diversity of thought in boards. I think something I heard woven through all the panel's responses were effectively the old cliche, in a sense, that culture trumps everything else. I mean, I think if NEDs are watching that and thinking about it, does it feel right? It probably is. And I think the final thing, which brings us nicely back to the purpose of this breakfast, is prepare yourselves as NEDs. Read the guide. I mean, that's exactly what this guide and the authors have tried to do, and brings me only to say great thank you to the panel members and to Paul Ree again, and to everyone at Resilience First for facilitating it. I believe the Prime Minister has just resigned, so that's an end to it. So yes. we end on a point of resilience challenge. So listen, thank you everybody. Have a good resilience day, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye now.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks everyone. Thanks.
Bye bye. Bye.
Thank you, Simon.